Airing first on Asheville FM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting out of occupied Salagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world. This week on The Final Straw Radio, we spoke with Dylan and Enzo of Unity and Struggle. Unity and Struggle, or UNS, is an anti-state communist collective spread across the so-called United States. Their members publish essays and engage in local organizing activities. Enzo recently authored a short essay entitled How Do We Stop a Coup?, which had editorial contribution by the wider UNS collective. For the hour, we talk about the threat of a constitutional coup, the importance of street action and organizing among the working classes to resist authoritarianism, and ideas about fighting recuperation by liberal power structures like the Democrat Party and nonprofit organizations. More by UNS, including this essay, can be found at unityandstruggle.org. You can also find a mini-series of podcasts with Unity and Struggle talking about their study group on race over 5 parts, starting in November of 2019 on RevLeft Radio. The Final Straw Radio is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
Anarchism, a social philosophy which aims at the emancipation, economic, social, political, and spiritual of the human race.
Anarchism is not bombs, disorder, or chaos. It is not robbery or murder. It is not a war of each against all.
Anarchism is the very opposite of all that. Find out for yourself. Tune into Subversion 1312.
Live, Tuesdays 9 to 10 p.m.
on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM or streaming 4ZZZ.org.au.
Podcasts and related content available at subversion1312.org
and channelzeronetwork.com.
Conclusion?
We stand for anarchy, anti-capitalism, anti-racism, anti-authoritarianism, internationalism,
autonomy, direct democracy, ecology, self-organization, solidarity, anti-fascism, anti-neoliberalism,
anti-nationalism, atheism, equality, and freedom.
And now for a brief announcement. This Monday, October 26th, there will be a march in Lincoln, Nebraska at the state capitol at 14th and K from 11:30 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. in support of the review of the wrongful conviction and eventual release of Ed Poindexter. Mr. Poindexter is the surviving member of the Omaha Two, who, along with Mopashitwe Mondo Ayan Wailanga, whose state name was David Rice, were convicted and sentenced to life in prison for the 1971 murder of Omaha police officer Larry Menard on August 17, 1971. The two were suspects before there was any evidence in the case because they were leaders of the National Committee to Combat Fascism, a splinter from the Black Panther Party. Despite shoddy investigations and signs of evidence tampering by authorities, an appeal to the conviction based on new evidence that surfaced in the case of the Omaha Two was denied in 2010 by the Nebraska Supreme Court due to limitations imposed by Bill Clinton's 1996 Effective Death Penalty and Anti-Terrorism Act, a law mentioned by Sing-Q McGee in our last episode. The Nebraska Board of Pardons will be meeting on Monday afternoon, and supporters are invited to participate in a public comment period at the end from 4 to 5 p.m., depending on the length of the hearings. Mondo died in prison of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease on March 11, 2016. After being incarcerated from the ages 23 to 69 years old. Ed has diabetes and had a triple bypass heart surgery in 2016. He's confined to a wheelchair and has cataracts that limit his ability to read. He does not deserve this treatment and needs to be released after 49 years of wrongful conviction. If Ed Poindexter is not pardoned, we will speak pretty soon with supporters of his case. Meanwhile, you can get involved and support him by visiting the Fedbook page entitled Freedom for Ed. That's the number 4. You can also contact that group at freedomfored@gmail.com. Again, the number 4. You can write to Ed, whose 76th birthday is coming up on November 1st, at Edward Poindexter, number 27767, Nebraska State Penitentiary, P.O. Box 22500, Lincoln, Nebraska, 68542. Please be aware that because of the cataracts in his eyes, text on letters should be no smaller than an 18-point font. More information can also be found on Ed's case and many more at prisonersolidarity.com. And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We'll come like a war!
Violence. Delusional hierarchs often tell me that the problem with anarchists is that we're so violent. We advocate violent responses and we smash windows. We light dumpsters on fire and we tip over cop cars. In fact, anarchists and violence are so inextricably linked in the hierarch mind that the first thing they imagine when someone says the word anarchist is fire and madness. I was born in 1969. The day that I was born, thousands were bombed by the United States in Vietnam. The war there had begun before I was born. So, though I am an anarchist and though I advocate political violence, I didn't invent violence. Violence existed long before I was born. I'm sure your situation is like mine, that you were born into a world where violence already existed. A world run by hierarchs where violence pervaded, saturating every element of our lives, part of the fabric of the social order. Hierarchs have been in charge for roughly 8,000 years. During that time, violence has been a daily occurrence. Not one single day has the sun rose and set without an outbreak of violence. Think about all of the wars that have occurred in the past 8,000 years. Every single war was fought for nation-states or religious leaders exercising hierarchical authority. Every single one. So, for the last 8,000 years, hierarchs have started every war. Think about all that death and suffering and destruction. In just one theatre of combat during a period of about 2 years, the Russians lost more than 10 million people. 10 million people. So, in just the fighting on the Russian front during World War II, the hierarchs slaughtered more people than anarchists have collectively killed throughout all of human history. If we compare body counts, I don't think anarchists can compete with hierarchs. Let's look at the evolving technology of violence. Guns, cannons, dynamite, all invented by hierarchs. Battleships, tanks, attack helicopters, all invented and designed by hierarchs. Nukes, invented, built and dropped exclusively by hierarchs. One single hierarch, named Harry Truman, dropped one bomb, killing more people than were killed by all anarchists combined. Every assassinated US president was killed by a hierarch, except McKinley. Out of 45 presidents, we only knocked one off. And he was, by all accounts, pretty mediocre. I think we all have to admit that even the best ones were pretty mediocre. All crimes against humanity were committed by hierarchs, from the genocide in the Americas engineered by Custer and others, to the Nazi concentration camps, to the millions exterminated by Pol Pot in Cambodia. Everywhere you find systematic mass murder, you'll find hierarchs, with their machetes or their Zyklon B. Zyklon B, invented by hierarchs. Consider all of the economic mismanagement and corruption that has led to immiseration, suffering and starvation on a mass scale. All of it carried out by hierarchs. So when hierarchs waggle a finger at me and denounce anarchists for our violence, I am often left somewhat speechless. It's hard for me to follow their arguments, distracted as I am by the corpses falling out of their mouths. I guess what I'm trying to say is, anarchists didn't invent violence. We didn't shape and mold a world that is defined more than anything else by violence, where those in charge inflict it and where those who make the rules obtain their positions and keep their positions by being better at it than everyone else. Hierarchs did that, and to stop their madness, to stop their violence, we're going to have to be better at it than they are. Not because we're enamored with violence, but because we are opposed to it. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain missing in action, silenced by an Ohio prison fart goblin. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can write to Sean Swain at his latest address at Sean Swain, number 2015638, Buckingham Correctional, P.O. Box 430, Dillwyn, Virginia, 23936. You can find his past writings, recordings of his audio segments, and updates on his case at seanswain.org, or now follow him on Twitter at SwainRocks. Big thanks to Linda from Subversion 1312 for reading Sean's words. So I'm joined by two members of Unity and Struggle, which describes itself as a, quote, national anti-state communist collective, unquote. I was hoping to speak with these guests about the collective and about their recent article entitled, How Do We Stop a Coup? Thank you so much, both of you, for joining me for this conversation.
Thanks for having us.
Definitely.
Would you please introduce yourselves further with any names or pronouns or locations or other important information that the audience should know?
Yeah, I'm Dylan. I'm a member of Unity and Struggle. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm based in Atlanta.
I am Enzo. I use he, him pronouns, also a member of Unity and Struggle, and I am in Seattle.
Cool. So I'd love to learn more about Unity and Struggle. The group describes itself as anti-state communist. Can you talk a bit about what that means, maybe any analogous groupings or movements that listeners might be familiar with from history or from other countries' contexts, and like sort of what thinkers influence you, points of unity?
Definitely. So I think that the descriptor anti-state communists has been one that we've been kind of attached to, or at least I've been attached to for a couple of years now. I think that really, it has been an effort in kind of finding affinities with other people. I think historically the group has taken a lot from the Johnston Forest tendency, CLR James and Raya Dunayevskaya. They're kind of a breakaway from Trotskyism. We also, I think, historically take a lot from the Sojourner Truth Organization. And then we find a lot of commonality with communization theory now, angry workers in the UK, and other groups like that. We also have a lot of friends with anarchists. The May 1st Anarchist Alliance that used to exist, we had affinities with them as well.
What's the purpose of the collective? Is it primarily publishing texts, or do you organize under the auspices of Unity and Struggle?
Yeah. We try to do quite a lot. One thing that brings us together is to do kind of collective theorizing. So an example of that is for the last about a year now, we've been engaging in a race study. And it's not just with members of Unity and Struggle, but with others as well. And we partnered up with RevLeft Radio, for instance, to do a podcast on different units of the race study that we're doing. We also try to strategize together. So we think through big moments like this one, thinking through mass movements and how to engage those mass movements. And we all organize. So we come together to support each other's organizing, whether that's with housing or labor, police and prison abolition, and more. But we don't see our role as militants as just being to build unity and struggle. We try to foster networks and connections across cities in the US and internationally as well, and build with other folks outside of unity and struggle. We also organize with other people outside of unity and struggle. But UNS for us is a kind of political home where we can do that theoretical and strategic work together, and kind of trying to build a political tendency and a politics that matches our times and isn't just simply borrowed from the past, but is actually understanding our current moment to understand how we should best be engaging.
Out of curiosity, like, how does UNS engage with more traditional, like, state communist groupings or like Leninist formations? I know that there's obviously in your points of unity and what you've described, and also your explicitly anti-state perspective, pointing to CLR James and other thinkers who broke with a lot of those theoretical tendencies. Do you organize much or engage much with, again, Marxist-Leninist groups?
I think that as opposed to tending towards organizing or engaging with the kind of formal left in general, we tend to organize with and engage with more everyday people and folks who we're meeting through organizing projects. So through housing organizing, labor organizing, et cetera. Now, that's not to say, of course, we have relationships with other groups in the US and do engage them at times. But for instance, for me, I'm down here in the South. So I think it's a little bit different areas of the country. But in Georgia, we just don't have that many Leninist groupings anyway. And we don't have that many like organized political groups in Georgia anyway, like far left ones, for instance. I don't know if you have more to say on that, Enzo.
No, I think like you said, Dylan, a lot of our organizing is in neighborhoods and is with just, regular people. We do a lot of tenant organizing. We've done, stuff like that. So, our interactions with other groups are really on the basis of how we're organizing. So if other people are interested in organizing with us in specific ways, then I think that we can get down. But yeah, we're not looking for formal alliances or formal work with other kind of leftist groupings. Although we do, like we both said, we have affinities with other groups and stuff like that. But yeah, a lot of our work with other leftist groups comes through our organizing.
This is The Final Straw, and I'm Bursts, and you're hearing my conversation with Enzo and Dylan, two members of Unity and Struggle, an anti-state communist collective, about how we can collectively organize to resist a constitutional coup. Well, so Unity and Struggle as a collective published the essay that Enzo had initially written and the collective had collaborated in with edits, I guess, is listed on the website. But how do we stop a coup? And it was published on October 4th. Since this is such a confusing time, could we walk through this essay for listeners at home and maybe like not just in the US, but abroad, and talk about sort of the assumptions in it and also some of the conclusions that you come with? For instance, that the Trump administration is, in fact, preparing what might be called a constitutional coup?
Yeah, definitely. We think that, and I think a lot of people agree with this, if we look from even starting in 2016, we've seen Trump and his campaign and the administration working to discredit the basic so-called democratic institutions in society and to sow a lot of confusion and distrust. And we see this through Trump constantly talking about fake news, you can't trust the news, also some of the claims that he's made about voter fraud that's happening right now, the controversy around the Postal Service, for instance. And at the same time that he's sowing this kind of distrust and confusion, he's packing the courts with incompetent judges, with kind of bizarre at times and really disturbing beliefs, and purging the Republican Party of dissidents through retirements or through primaries, and often many times we've seen just firing a ton of people. And he's remained really committed to the most reactionary elements of his base, which, while those elements are still a minority, they've been able to carry out violent acts with both implicit and explicit support from Trump in certain wings of the state as well. So he's rallying his supporters right now, for instance, to engage in voter intimidation at the polls on election day. We all know he's has failed to denounce white supremacists and, for instance, telling the Proud Boys to stand back and stand by. So some of this stuff, which was abstract months ago when people would talk about him dog whistling to the far right, has become a lot more concrete. And we can kind of see this too in Portland, where we were able to see which parts of the state were most loyal to him. And the uprisings this summer showed that he does have a base within the state. While it might not be the majority, there's a base here. So Homeland Security and police rank and files across the country might gladly carry out voter intimidation or repress protests during the election time. And efforts to rein in these forces have proven really toothless, even in cities with Democratic leadership. So the Democratic Party hasn't been able to control this kind of volatile base. Of course, it's not possible always for us to see in advance how something might be executed, but as we're getting closer, kind of a lot of the things we've been afraid of are shaking out and happening. So we think kind of the combination of these things is setting it up so that Trump absolutely could attempt a constitutional coup. Even, for instance, this past Sunday, there's a headline on the New York Times about how all of these, this court packing that Trump has done is already proving very useful for him. So, for instance, with the controversy in Texas, the governor was trying to make it so there was a single ballot box for drop-off ballots in Harris County, which is where Houston is, where there's more than 2 million voters. And at first, a lower court stepped up and blocked that, but then 3 judges who Trump appointed were able to appeal that. And so as of last Sunday, at least, there's a single ballot box for all of Harris County. So all of these moves he's been making to try to pack the courts and have these kind of institutional ways that he can hold on to power, we're seeing some of that work.
I think that since we published the essay, the position paper, I think on the same day that was published, Peter Gelderloos published a fairly similar analysis. Additionally, Matthew Lyons of Three-Way Fight, who I think is just really, really strong on the fascism question. I am extremely influenced by his work on fascism and the far right, but he also put out a recent piece that has a very similar analysis. So I think that the things that we have been seeing over the past 9 months that I think really started with the impeachment, and we saw how the Republican Party really coalesced behind Trump. And I think that was the first time that it was extremely obvious that the functions of the government were kind of taking a turn. And that these formal rules that a lot of people and a lot of liberals continue to rely on are being trod on. And like Dylan said, 25% of federal courts federal court positions have been filled by Trump himself. You have all of these things, this coalition that has been forming around Trump for the past 4 years, but has been more visible for the past 9 months. And I think that all of these things are trending towards us seeing parts of the Republican establishment and then parts of the right, kind of the independent right, coming together to essentially intervene in the election.
And a lot of it kind of falls into I haven't heard it talked about for a while as an ideology, but there's certain ideologues within the Republican Party that are pushed for like the unitary executive idea that, putting so much central, as opposed to a balance of power between the three different branches of government, putting the majority of it into the executive and almost moving towards a monarchical system.
Yeah. I think that this is speculation, but we know that Stephen Miller was a huge ideologue in the Trump administration from the very beginning. I think that when history looks back, when they see Bill Barr's entrance into Trump's administration, I think the trajectory of where Trump's administration was going shifted. I think that Bill Barr has allowed for a lot more of the repression and the links being built between Trump and the DHS. I think that Bill Barr is a big part of that, and I think that history will see that. Again, complete speculation at this point, but I think that I honestly believe that.
Yeah, and it seems like it's also kind of like hard to pin down, I guess, what's going on now. And I think like a lot of it also becomes really fraught. I mean, in some ways it makes sense that it'd be fraught with partisanship, like Democrat versus Republican. But a lot of the tools that are being wielded right now have been being built over the last, 3 administrations at least, like with the centralization of the executive branch, with the foundation of DHS, with executive orders like under Obama, even though they're escalating out of proportion with Trump's administration, like it's been building in this direction, and it was just an amount of time until one administration chose to take advantage of what was in their hands, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we're really seeing the spinelessness of the Democratic Party, and that's partially because, like you said, they've created the situation. They've created the potential for a constitutional coup, and they kind of seemingly don't know how to respond now. What we're expecting is for the Democratic Party to tell everyone to go home and stay home and let the courts work it out. Of course, the great irony is that if the courts work it out, they very well may work it out in Trump's favor. And we saw this over the summer as well, where we had Democratic mayors or governors speaking out against the repression that the Trump administration was bringing to local areas. But that's all that they did, right? They spoke out against it. There was no real power moves being made. And so I think that even parts of the base of the Democratic Party right now are largely deluding themselves that they think that the Democratic Party is going to do anything to stop this from happening. The party themselves still have so much faith in their democratic institutions, which, frankly makes sense because, of course, nobody really likes Joe Biden. He's not a very popular candidate. And the machine allowed Joe Biden to get to the place where he is now. So it's one that's largely benefited them. But in this case, might absolutely turn against them. But I don't think that the Democratic Party is necessarily prepared for that situation at all. And I'm frankly a bit surprised that they wouldn't think to try to call on everyday people to go out into the streets, because we know that's the only thing that could win here. But they won't do that, right? They'll put their faith in the court system, and probably not much else. Unclear.
Yeah, Democrats seem to be willing to just lose as long as it has the air of legitimacy. They are willing to allow authoritarianism to take hold, take true control of the government, as long as it has the air of constitutionality.
When you all were talking about scenarios that the article proposed, how did you come up with, what are those scenarios for how this election might pan out in your estimation? And how did you come up with the maths as to what would be the likely outcomes of those? Like, for instance, guesstimating the likely engagements and numbers from the far right, like militias, for instance, or QAnoners, I guess, from the center, or just always Trumpers, from the center, or people that are maybe not engaged in autonomous politics, and from the anti-racist and anti-fascist side.
Yeah, like you kind of said, it is really kind of a numbers game. It's looking at the forces that exist in the country and kind of seeing what the most likely scenarios coming out of them are. I think that our first scenario essentially is, the possibility that Joe Biden wins with a commanding lead, so much so that Trump can no longer, the feasibility of a constitutional coup is no longer viable. What that number is, we're not sure, or what that would look like, unsure. But what we can say about a Joe Biden presidency is it's essentially zombie centrism. All it is a centrism that nobody believes in anymore, that is incapable of truly dealing with the crises. What it represents is maybe a 4-year arms race, essentially, between all the factions, the left, the right, everybody in between. So that's what a Joe Biden winning kind of outright would look like. The second scenario, which I think is still more likely, even with the polling as it is that we see a red mirage on election night. So because most liberals and Democrats are voting by mail, we will see that it looks like Trump is winning on election night. At that point, the Trump and the Republican establishment will attempt to use legalistic manners to stop recounts. Before that, we might see Trump use the DHS. We might see police rank and file. We might see militia people going to polling places, intimidating voters, things like that. And then while the legalistic aspect is happening with Trump and the Republican establishment, we can predict that there will be continued concentrations of fighting between left and right forces. especially in those places where the election is maybe close or electoral counts have the biggest weight. So I believe it is Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. All of their mail-in votes cannot be counted until the day of the election. And Pennsylvania, according to a number of statistical models, Pennsylvania is the place that will kind of decide the election. So we know from the spring and the reopen protests that those three states also have, militia and right-wing members in it. So we can predict that, because there's a limited place where electoral votes are important, and because there are, not everybody has perfect forces, that they'll likely commit their forces and commit their energies to the places where that energy will have the most payoff. But with that, I think Portland is a really good counterexample to that. Portland is a liberal city, has no real electoral significance, but was harassed by the DHS for weeks, and threats were made to send DHS and others into other liberal cities. So as we can say that it's probable that Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, states that were close in the last election and are predicted to be close this time we'll see the most chaos, but that's not to say that we won't see it in other places as well.
Yeah. It's a big old knot in the gut from it. Before all this, we already fucked from it. The world burned just to serve the corrupted. Smug fucks buying bulletproof trucks for it. Ooh fuck, destruction's sick. The markets are all a bottomless pit. The future wobbles and the present shit. The cause of problems profits from it. We caught a glimpse of the fraud. They pulled back the curtain on the great Oz, and facade cracked and it all paused. We saw the conflict, we gotta resolve for it. There's just no going back to shit. No two tabs and we're back, so sit back to it. No map or path to the math in this shit. Just midway past the start of collapsing. It's all happening, it's adapting. The capital snatching, maximum stack from it. Masses get the minimum pass to them. Gads, bats, and gases for just asking. No mask, they made it great again. Concentration camps, kids in cages, labor wages, incarceration. They turn the tabs to blast them the hatred. Flavor fascists, dash of freedom. They open carry AR-15s and leave their religion on repeat until they've mythologized they G.I. Jesus. Jesus, COVID, cracker Christ. They hold a life or they throw them dice. The courts enforcing corporate rights. The borders, cops, soldiers, and ICE. More to life than fear of death. There's more to life than just paying your rent. There's more to live for than putting dents in your credit score during the course of a pandemic. And it's all hands on deck. They've invested us in fortune, Forbes indexes, offshore scores, next best, dressed in chest protecting Kevlar vests and shit. And we've learned to build a nest in it. Lessons tested, the Great Depression, the burned and the disparity is etched. And we learn it's solidarity or it's death. And we don't accept it, reject it. Trajectories of your interventions. No mention of bread or getting fed. We'll paint your floors and your walls in red. We're probably already dead from it. The future rears its ugly head at us. The devil jerked the chain on the neck and cracks the whips. Says get back to stepping, kid. They've weaponized our fears, suggested threats to what we hold dear. They'll chalk the loss of all the arrears, and they'll toss the hostages into the gears. Fizzy tears, the official beverage of the 2020 COVID pandemic. Cameras panned, the stands are packed with bankers, landlords, corporate backers. Chanting, they want it back again. Or acting like it never even happened and get us back into these spending habits. The assets amassed in havens of taxes. There's just no going back to shit. No vacation package and then back to it. No map, no path on the math of this shit. We're midway past the start of the collapsing. It's all happening, it's adapting. The capital snatching, maximum stack from it. Masses keep the minimum past it. Don't catch gats, bats, and gases for just asking. So don't make us ask for it. So don't make us ask. So don't make us ask for it. So don't make us ask. Don't make us ask for it. Don't make us ask, man.
This is The Final Straw, and I'm Bursts, and you're hearing my conversation with Enzo and Dylan, two members of Unity and Struggle, an anti-state communist collective, about how we can collectively organize to resist a constitutional coup. Can you say a little bit more about how y'all view the relationship between street activity or street presence and power, between like not necessarily autonomous, but in some cases autonomous movements, and how that translates or how that interrelates in some of these scenarios with institutional power?
So yeah, I think that one thing that we have seen recently is a lot of the narratives about what could happen in after the election and during the election really reside on what the Democratic Party is doing and what the Republican Party is doing, and then kind of how things are playing out with electors and with judges. And I think that does a real disservice to our understanding of what can happen, because it really depends on mass action. You can see in Belarus, all the state actors did exactly what they wanted to do. They threw the election for their dictator, but people came out regardless, and are still were putting themselves on the line to push back against authoritarianism. And so I think that we can see the same things if they were to happen in the United States. Over the past 4 years, the day before inauguration, Black Bloc actions in many cities were huge. We had the Women's March, and then we had airport occupations throughout, or in that early time in the Trump administration. And then this past summer, we had, according to multiple places, one of the large, if not the largest, social movement in the United States that changed people's perceptions of Black Lives Matter 6 years ago, essentially. So you can see that mass action is going to be the thing that can change these things. And then additionally, one of the things is that mass action is going to protect us from the right. The right comes in when protests are dwindling, when there are smaller amounts of people, when it's really just kind of the left doing it again. Then the right is able to kind of come in, mob on us, attack us, and things like that. But when we have the numbers in the streets, they're nowhere around. They're scared. They're shook. They can't deal with us. And so if we are putting those efforts, at the very beginning of the George Floyd protests, a lot of it was the riot was adopted immediately, kind of taken further than we could have expected. And then, a social movement kind of rose behind it. And in the same way, we can think of a movement against a coup, against a historically unpopular president, actually. All of these things that have been building, we can capitalize on, we can use. And I think that, that is what we should, as leftists and as people who are kind of outside of mainstream politics, these are the things that we can affect. And these are the things that we can bring to the table.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the summer and some of the lessons that the protests over the summer show us for this. Because like Enzo said, we had possibly the largest mass movement in American history, which is a somewhat strange way, I think, to think or talk about that, because we know there's been larger conjunctural crisis that's occurred. But with the protests over the summer, despite the fact that we had these mass movements, we won very little out of those mass movements, right? We didn't have these kind of big sweeping reforms that people were out in the streets demanding. And it's because the capitalist class is in crisis themselves, and capital itself is in crisis. They're not able at this point to give us the reforms that we need. When our demand is to abolish the police or to defund the police and dismantle the police in these cities, and they're relying on the police to repress us, they're not going to match that demand. And so one lesson from that, though, for me, and I think for many of us, is that we should take away is we're not suggesting that the point of us going out in the streets is to get a Biden presidency, right? No, the point of us going out in the streets is to build class power towards liberatory goals, right? So we think no matter, from my perspective too, I'm like, no matter what happens, even if it looks like Biden's going to win the election, we should be out in the streets. And we should do it in a way where we're flexing our power and we're shaping the narrative and trying to control the streets so that we can have that collective experience and can continue to build. And then at the same time, I want to say that while we're talking so much right now because of about this electoral crisis and talking about going out into the streets and mass action, we don't fetishize street protest as like, this is the end all be all, this is the way we're going to do it. We also need to be continuing to organize and build that organizational infrastructure and networks of resistance that are having experiences in the workplace, fighting their landlords, etc. And we need to tie those things together, hopefully, in this electoral crisis and in the year that follows, as we're continuing to organize, facing multiple crises, right? We saw people resisting, not as large as we did with the George Floyd protest, but we saw people resisting at work. And it's still happening. There's teachers, for instance, all over the country right now who are still protesting against the reopenings, and they're winning, and this is outside of any unions. So we're seeing this kind of wildcat activity. We saw some of this with nurses, with essential workers. And then we're also seeing people resisting evictions, and whether that's getting neighbors together. And sometimes we've seen a couple groups, right, chain the doors of the courthouse, for instance, to stop those evictions, or together participate in rent strikes and such. So we need all of those things. But we do feel strongly like this moment isn't a moment that we can or should sit out and let the ruling class fight amongst themselves and resolve it. Because no matter what happens, it has profound effects for us. And if there is a constitutional coup, if we're living under authoritarianism, that has very serious repercussions. We can't just like disconnect from the state and say, oh, the state is something outside of us. And we live in that world, and that world has really serious effects for us. Like we saw all over the summer with so many people facing really severe repression because of the George Floyd uprising.
I think that Unity and Struggle believes that people grow through struggle. And people grow through the experience of struggling against power. And so like, even if we think of like a protest in, mass action against a constitutional coup, even if we kind of can see that is the end result of that is going to be a Biden presidency. I think that, to use Marxist terms, the content exceeds the form in this case. You have a mass movement. If if it's possible, you will have a mass movement that goes up against authoritarianism, that people, everyday people, and leftists, whether they're doing tenant union organizing, base building, whether they're in unions or they're talking to their unions about doing a wildcat strike or something, all of these people kind of getting together, understanding their ability to create change. I think that taking on and being able to fight back against an authoritarian crisis. Yeah, I think that the content of that exceeds just the fact that a Democratic president is being elected, essentially. I think that, we can use that as a jumping off point for building bigger and better things.
So that sort of like touches on a question that I was going to ask about, like what is our dog in the race as anti-authoritarians and anti-capitalists? Because all of the activities thus far that movements have been engaging in, whether like originating from the left or from populations that have specifically been impacted by certain kinds of oppression that have become more mass movements, for instance, the George Floyd rebellion of this year. We've seen politicians politic. We've seen politicians take that energy and incorporate it into their own momentum, take some terminology and sort of reframe it and whittle it down until it doesn't actually mean anything, but in the hopes of actually holding on to some of the impassioned people to maybe squeeze a little more campaign donation or some footwork of, knocking on doors and handing out, information about that specific politician, whatever. But so how do we, moving forward through this, if we decide to put ourselves out there actively against authoritarianism, but in the middle of this battle between competing capitalist parties, how do we keep our autonomy?
Yeah, I think it's a time too in which we should get creative and we should brainstorm together about exactly this question that you have. Because I think some amount of co-optation or attempts by the Democratic Party or the nonprofit machine to kind of control the street activity is unavoidable. I was thinking about 2016, after Trump's election. Many people went out to protest the election of Trump because they wanted Hillary to be president, right? Others went out to protest the entire charade and had banners that said no more presidents as opposed to no Trump, right? So while some people said not my president, others said no more presidents. And I'm curious about what ways we can get creative to raise that bigger picture of what we're really fighting for here. So what does it look like, for instance, to call for free and fair elections? In what way does that call into question the freeness and fairness of the existing American electoral system, right? No, we don't want Biden either. What does it look like for us to actually have candidates running for us? And that being said, right, I'm not pro-electoral strategy. I think that the electoral strategy has immediately shown itself to be a failure just in the last few years here, right? But yeah, just thinking through what ways can we be creative in our local areas or whatever to push things further as far as we possibly can, while at the same time understanding that this likely won't be the moment in which we're able to, for instance, get rid of the American electoral system. This probably isn't the revolutionary moment, but it is one of many moments that we have, or opportunities that we have, to both defend against the coup and push further.
This is The Final Straw, and I'm Bursts, and you're hearing my conversation with Enzo and Dylan, two members of Unity and Struggle, an anti-state communist collective, about how we can collectively organize to resist a constitutional coup. We've talked a bit about the importance of strength in the streets and not letting that get taken. We've talked about looking beyond the horizons that are being presented by the parties in power and building like autonomous power. And that it's not, as Dylan said, like it's not just about holding the street and street tactics, but also around organizing. We got, 2 weeks left until this whole thing blows up. What do you all or does Unity and Struggle propose that we do in the time remaining until the election? A lot of people are going to be like scrambling and saying, oh, I should have started, 10 years ago or whatever. With this like looming crisis, do you have suggestions for folks moving forward and getting prepared for what might be a catastrophic and violent electoral season?
Yeah, 2 weeks is certainly not long, but we think there's still something that we can do in 2 weeks. We think people can reach out to their broader networks to start developing coordinated plans in this time. So that might look like facilitating trainings for marches, street medics, jail support, other key skills. We can link with the bases of nonprofits and trade union rank and file that are fighting voter suppression right now. And again, not to join their efforts, but to find others who might take action independent of the Democratic Party. Share agitational materials with friends and family in the military or National Guard. In what ways can we hopefully neutralize sections of the National Guard, for instance? We can be coordinating to like rack up our propaganda game, have memes, flyers ready to go on deck, and circulate calls for day after rallies in our various cities. So for us, that some of this looks like starting to call our networks of people all over the US and say, what are you planning? How can we plan together? How can we coordinate together for a day after stuff? On election day, we can expose voter intimidation and harassment by the right. We know this is going to be happening at the polls, especially in swing states, but likely at many places around the US. And if it appears that a coup is taking shape, we can call these day after rallies in response. And again, the point here is to establish this narrative of popular resistance to a Trump coup. We know that the right might try to get protesters into confrontations, and we should try to avoid those physical confrontations unless attacked, because our power and safety here is going to lie in numbers and kind of setting the terms of the crisis. And we don't think that if, especially the second scenario, the one in which Trump is really actively attempting a constitutional coup, we don't think that it's just going to be election day, but there's going to be a lot to do in the weeks that follow as well, because this might play out as it's kind of playing out the courts, will likely also be playing out the streets in many weeks to follow. And so in those moments, in the weeks that follow, we might see far right violence in different parts of the country. And we can use that opportunity when there's far right violence in any part of the country to mobilize everywhere in response to that. Because again, like we said before, our numbers do outweigh theirs, right? And that's where our power lies. And assuming that mass actions overwhelm the ability of militias to intimidate people, then we should expect, like we saw over the summer, federal interventions, like we saw in DC and Portland. And at that point, dissent within the National Guard or political job actions taking place from different sectors of the economy could prove really decisive, and also prepare for a deeper break. So we're thinking about, okay, how do we prepare not just for the day, but for many weeks that follow? And what does it look like to be working with people that we're organizing with in, say, sectors of the economy or tenants, et cetera, to take political action during that time?
Well, yeah, thank you so much for thinking on this and doing all this work, y'all, and publishing this, Enzo. Where can people learn more about Unity and Struggle and possibly get involved with y'all in that work?
Absolutely. Our website is unityandstruggle.org. That has a number of our writings throughout the history of Unity and Struggle. We are on both Instagram and Twitter as Unity and Strug with 1G. And you can catch us there. Also, I think, we were on RevLeft Radio for the summaries and the discussions of our race study. So if you're interested in hearing our development through that, I'd also suggest listening into that.
Cool. And I'm happy to put a link to that and to y'all's website in the show notes. Thank you so much, Dylan and Enzo, for having this conversation, taking the time, coordinating, and the thoughtful responses to my questions.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us on.
activism for short. That's Antifa. So if you hate on that, David Duke must be your teacher. I'm trying to see some UNATY like Latifah. That's kinda hard with Donald Trump as they leader. 5 years for some weed, now they legalizing reefer. Hate it when we speak, but our music on they speakers. Hate it when we kneel, but they love buying our sneakers. Shut up and dribble while they killing all your people. Might catch a session in the hood with the homies, but I'd rather catch sessions in the hood with the homies. Or maybe Stephen Miller, or maybe Mike Pence. I'm trying to punch Richard Spencer with the strength of Richard Dent. So long live Heather, I'ma say that line forever. She gave her life so we can make tomorrow better. Oh, I heard you proud, boy. You really proud, boy? I'll punch you in your lip, leave you leaking from the mouth, boy. Y'all ain't even deep, unless you backed up by police. Bigger threats on these streets, that don't mean you get to speak. Shut it down when y'all around, nothing to talk about. If you out to kill my people, I'ma turn them tables round like fire to the fascists. Fire to the fascists. Fire to the fascists. Fire to the fascists. Pinochet was wrong, but fuck the right. That include the liberals, black, Latino, and white. Anybody that put a price on your hard work a day, profiting while you struggling to make it to payday. Labor that you gave and paid for, they vacate. Workers versus the bosses, I'm Chicago on May Day. Haymarket struggle gave us 8-hour work days. Free market hustlers want us hungry and thirsty. No love for fascists, no love for headfans, no love for anyone furthering my oppression. Poder a las mujeres, make power collectivist. Anything else is fascism in development.
Fuck the Proud Boys, you out of style, boy. I run a mile for it, Glock in my hand, busting at all y'all. Load up this semi and thrust it at all y'all. I don't give a fuck, hit them bastards up, shoot them bastards up. Fuck Robert Brown, 16 in the clip and I gotta throw it. My dick bigger than yours and you gotta know it. I'm kamikaze, I know they despise me. Shoot at your dome, I say it wisely. Ski mask covered cause they can't recognize me. Fuck a Nazi, I'm throwing shots at your chest like fuck your body. Pipe bomb getting mailed to a Klansman. Since y'all tried to kill Maxine Waters, let that be the answer. I ain't got no love for none of y'all. We ain't them lanes you see on TV, run up on me, then the gun involved. I break through, every word out of Donald Trump's mouth is fake news. Fire to the fascists, I got it mastered, fly, fly. Fuck the Proud Boys and Mike Pence, you can suck my dick. Probably be murdered rapping stuff like this.
Fire to the fascists. Fire to the fascists. Fire to the fascists. Fire to the fascists.
This is The Final Straw, and I'm Bursa Goodness. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw Radio, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816.